Hey guys, Jason here, and welcome to part 1 of our TCG Revamped Retrospective mini-series. In this video, I'll be giving an overview of the project, talking about what the project meant to us, and I'll also be shedding light on the creative choices that governed it. If you've been reading the descriptions of the videos, you will know TCG Revamped is a project we undertook over the past several months, and as the name indicates, it involved us giving facelifts to the old decks of the channel. In the past, our card pool was restricted to cards we had easy access to, and of course information we had at the time. Since our first wave of deck profiles, a lot has happened. More TCG channels popped up, meaning there were new strategies we could learn from. The release of DM Plays gave us some neat TCG-friendly ideas we weren't privy to in the past, and I also did a small study on the early OCG days, which presented its own set of findings. Most significantly, it had been a long time since our last deck profiles and people were asking about it, so I felt the time was right for us to return to our roots. Now let's delve deeper into our philosophy. The TCG being a discontinued game means there's no official body to tell players how to play the game. This means that players are free to design their own guidelines to create an environment they would find most enjoyable, and this is exactly what we did. Something I felt very strongly about was creating a format where any of us could just pick up a random deck and have a fairly competitive match. With this in mind, the primary objectives of the revamp were as follows. 1. Keeping the spirit of the original deck while pushing the idea as far as we could. We're aware that our version of Foul Control is much weaker than the Soulswap versions, and Fire Nature Rush is better than Fire Light Rush, but we love our decks and wanted to keep them as intact as possible. We didn't have any interest in solving the game. Our focus has always been more on pushing ideas, building highly functional decks to feature cards or ideas we like. 2. Closing the gap between the old frontrunners and stragglers. Balance was a major issue in the past and one we needed to address for my vision to come to life. While this wasn't going to be easy, I believe this was possible with the current crop of decks. 3. Granting competitive matchup spreads where possible. We were lucky to have a good mix of slow, medium, and fast decks, and I wanted to avoid an environment that was too matchup heavy. I wanted most matchups to be competitive, and this isn't to say every matchup had to be 50-50 even-steven, but it was important to avoid situations where a match just wasn't worth playing because one deck was so heavily favored. 4. Minimizing duplication. While it's impossible to avoid multiple representations of the same playstyle like aggro, control, etc., I felt very strongly about having each deck bring something new to the table. I wanted to make sure we weren't just copy-pasting the same list, give or take 10 cards, because what's the fun in that? And number 5, making the decks fun. Control decks can get pretty annoying to play against, but we also put a limit on how torturous they could get. Strategies like Deck Out and Mana Burn are pretty unfun. Losing to Bombazar doesn't feel very good either. We see the power of these strategies, but don't find them fun, so this is why we just stayed away from them. Now that we have the key philosophies in mind, we can go over how we went about creating the ideal environment. Control was unsurprisingly the best playstyle. We felt that it had an unfair advantage because it could abuse a larger deck size much better than other playstyles. This could be due to them being able to tech for everything, or simply just finding answers until the opponent ran out of cards, both of which felt like lame ways to play the game. It seemed as if control decks weren't sufficiently punished for trying to do too much, so I made the decision to restrict our format to 40 cards. With this limit, control decks had to more carefully plan how to use their more limited resources. Trying to squeeze in all the answers while retaining consistency became a trickier balancing act, and leaning too far in one direction would come at a cost in some way, shape, or form. More significantly, control decks were also encouraged to interact with the opponent's shields due to the imminent risk of deck out. It made the games more enjoyable for us, and even presented some other benefits like making deck building more straightforward, and making our lists friendly for the classic OCG format, which also plays 40 cards. Now that we've tackled the key philosophies, the next thing I want to talk about is card selection. When building the decks, we prioritized setups that we felt gave the decks the highest expected value across all matchups, rather than including cards that were really strong versus one end of the spectrum and a bit useless versus the other. An example of this is how Twin Cannon Turbo doesn't run any blocker hate like Scarlet Sky Terror or Windax. These cards are phenomenal against control decks with high blocker counts, but they're not very useful against other matchups. Instead, we were very deliberate with our inclusion of Maximum Apocalypse Vice, which does a pretty good job in clearing blockers, maybe not as good as Scarlet, but also works well against other decks in the pool. Another example of this is how Rub Control dropped Searing Wave and instead built around a turn 5 Blizzard of Spears because Blizzard could hit Petrova as well as whatever else Searing Wave was already hitting. With all that said, as much as we tried to create solid matchup spreads, there were still instances where decks had to live with unfavorable matchups because trying too hard to cover the bad matchups would ultimately make the deck worse. The next thing I'd like to talk about is my view of the ecosystem. In a more competitive environment, we might refer to this as a metagame, but my view of our format is that it's made up of a handful of decks that are all intended to be relevant, so the term metagame is less apt. Like with biological ecosystems, this one is made up of a network of complex moving parts, and I believe everything inside it has a role to play. Here's an overview of the spectrum of playstyles. I think it's interesting to see where each of the decks fit, and now that we know where things go, I'll quickly run through what each of these bring to the table. The outlier is our classical Rush deck, Liquid People Beatdown is Rush with a twist, Hydrus is kind of like the all-rounder, Beastfolk Mafia is our aggressive Petrova deck, or another way to look at it is as an aggro good stuffs pile. Dragons are go big or go home. Twin Cannon Turbo most closely resembles the classical mid-range deck. Wave Strikers are kind of like the Gimmick deck because they have the keyword, but I think they're actually good. Marino is the defensive Petrova deck. Worms is, of course, our beloved meme deck. Bull Medius Control is the classic control deck. And Foul Control is more of the teched out kind of control. Lastly, Survivors is our Solitaire deck. Like Wave Strikers, they're also built around a keyword. My last major talking point for this video is the problem cards. As small as the TCG card pool is, it of course has a handful of cards that tend to elicit a guttural reaction from the less maniacal early DM fans. You know the ones, Cranium Clamp, Soulswap. Our feelings on these cards are mixed, to say the very least. The first card we'll talk about is Cranium Clamp. One of my biggest fears with this card was that every deck running Darkness would just default to running 2 to 4 copies. However, closer examination of the card showed that this wouldn't be the case. I won't go as far to say that the decks employing Cranium Clamp were specifically built around Cranium Clamp, but with the 40 card limit, Clamp had to at least defend its position on why it should be included. Ultimately, Clamp exists to help the slower decks without mana ramp keep up with the faster decks, and it is weirdly kept in check by TDAD as well as Energy Stream to a certain extent. So while it isn't fun to get clamped once, let alone twice, it isn't without its shortcomings and, more significantly, does play a vital role in our ecosystem. And now Soulswap. Like with Cranium Clamp, we also feared excessive use of this card. Fortunately, it was clear which decks should be running it. When I talked about closing the gap between the decks, one of the ways I wanted to do this was by powering up the non-control decks. Seeing as that none of our control decks even ran Nature, Soulswap was perfect for the job. It is an absolutely dirty card, but it serves as a vital piece for getting concepts off the ground. The Dragon deck would completely fall apart without it, and its absence would make Survivors and Wave Strikers much less dangerous. Without ways to recycle Soulswap in our format, and fire kill spells making it somewhat harder to use, the card's degeneracy is kept in check. Is Soulswap broken? Yes, but ultimately we feel like its inclusion in the pool has made our game better. Cranium Clamp and Soulswap are obviously the main ones, but what about other broken cards like Miraculous Snare and Slash Charger? The reason these cards didn't make an appearance was because we felt like they weren't the best choices for what we wanted our decks to do. And while we do see these cards as nuisance cards as well, it's very likely they will have key roles to play, so you can expect to see them in future videos. No Bombazar though, sorry. That brings us to the end of the video, answers to the questions no one was asking. As you can see, we really wanted the project to celebrate what our channel is all about, using the TCG to pay homage to DM Plays and the early OCG, while having fun along the way. In the next part of the mini-series, I'll be going over the decks in greater detail, talking about how they've changed since the original deck profiles, and even since the most recent videos, because even we don't get it right the first time. But that's all for now. Thank you guys so much for watching, stay safe, and we'll see you guys next time.